So, after the Civil War, things changed completely, and the biggest change, obviously, was that slavery was no longer legal in the United States. This period was called Reconstruction, and that doesn't mean that they were rebuilding everything in the South, but some things were being reconstructed in a way that was not good for the people who were living there. So, during the war, you had Abraham Lincoln, who was the leader, and he led the North or the Union to victory against the South, the Confederacy, in the Civil War. And then halfway through the war, remember, he frees the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation. So while he's doing these things, he's endearing himself more to the North than to the South. So he has a dilemma when the war is over. He can either be nice to the South and try to get them to like him and back on his side, or he can punish them for doing what they did, punish them for slavery, punish them for trying to quit the Union, secede, and punishing them for trying to fight. So Abraham Lincoln, though, he actually decides to take the nice road and to be nice to the South. And a lot of Southerners, a lot of Democrats were very thankful to him because of that, and they liked that idea. Then Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. He's assassinated by a guy named John Wilkes Booth on April 14th, 1865. This is right after the war is over, right after the end. And so then, because he's assassinated, his vice president becomes president. Remember that in Washington, D.C., you have Lincoln and you have the rest of the North who are making federal laws for the entire country. And in the southern states, the southern politicians get to make their own laws. That's the system of federalism. Federal government for the whole country, and then each state has their own government. But the federal laws are supreme, and the federal government gets to control the army. So at this point, if the federal government makes a law that's different from the southern governments, from each of the southern states' laws, then the federal law is the one that stands, and the states don't have those rights. The federal government can enforce that using the army. And this is going to come into a huge disagreement, a huge conflict, a huge dispute. So what the federal government does is they pass 3 amendments to the Constitution, which are basically new laws to protect the rights of African Americans. Look at this cartoon here. You have white people over here brandishing weapons, clearly angry. And then you have the guy in the middle who is working for the federal government, and you can tell because he has the symbol of the flag behind him. And what he's doing is protecting the African Americans over here from these whites on this side. So he's holding the two groups apart, making sure that nobody gets hurt. Those are the Reconstruction Amendments passed by the federal Republicans, the federal government, to protect the rights of African Americans. These are the 3. The 13th Amendment ended slavery in the U.S., said no longer will there ever be any slavery anymore. The 14th Amendment gave equal citizenship to all African Americans. So it said that African Americans have the exact same rights as any white person who's also a citizen. But what happened was almost every state in the South didn't want this amendment to go through, but the North said that they had to if they wanted to come join the country again. So eventually they did, but the South was not very happy about this. And then the 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote. So immediately you have all these African Americans who were living in the South. Remember, there were more slaves than there were slave owners. So now in some places, there are more African Americans who are voting than white people. So immediately they get to run for office and they get to vote. They get to elect other African Americans. So then now you have Black people in politics making laws. And this is making the white Southerners really upset, because this is not what they were bargaining for. This is not what they wanted. So the president, who was Abe Lincoln's vice president, his name was Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson, when he becomes president, he wants to make as little conflict as possible. So he's going to let the southern states do whatever they want, even if it's racist. So all these things are going to happen, and Andrew Johnson is going to do nothing to protect the rights of African Americans. But in Congress, the people who are making the laws are called the radical Republicans. They're the ones who control the lawmaking apparatus, and they're the ones who want to use the power of the federal government to protect the rights of African Americans in the South. So you've got the president who's not protecting them, and then you have the radical Republicans in Congress who were protecting them. And some of those radical Republicans were African Americans themselves who'd been elected from the South. So we have a conflict of interest here. You have the legislative branch, the radical Republicans, who make laws, and then the executive branch, Andrew Johnson, who chooses not to enforce those laws. So because you have those two people doing completely different things, then there's nothing that's actually happening because Andrew Johnson is not enforcing anything. So then you've got a conflict between the two, right? They disagree. The radical Republicans pass laws, Andrew Johnson does nothing. Then something starts to happen where he can no longer ignore it. And that is what's called, or what's known as, the New Orleans Massacre. And a lot of people don't actually know that this happened. So you can go around and tell people or ask people if they know about the New Orleans Massacre. Most people don't know. But this was in the 1870s, and there were Black African Americans who were elected to the Louisiana government in New Orleans. And the white Southerners got together, they got a bunch of guns, and they marched on the government offices and killed those people who had been elected, those people who wanted to vote. So this is what the room looked like after they were done. People were dead on the floor. They had destroyed everything. People had tried to climb over the fence on the outside, and the white Southerners had run around to the back and just shot them as they were going. So there were tons and tons of people who died because they voted, because they got elected, because they were trying to change the laws to make them equal. When this happened, though, Andrew Johnson didn't do anything. He didn't enforce the law. He didn't send in the army to stop them. He didn't even arrest anybody for murder. There was nothing that happened as a result. So this makes the radical Republicans in Congress really angry. More and more stuff starts to happen, and Andrew Johnson still does nothing. You had whites who were pressuring blacks not to vote using violence. That was really the job of the KKK. The idea of the KKK was that they didn't want African Americans to vote. So they were going to use fear and they were going to use violence to stop them, just like in this cartoon and just like down here. And when all this stuff starts happening, even with the KKK's violence, Andrew Johnson still does nothing. So the radical Republicans at this point really have no choice because Andrew Johnson is not enforcing their laws. So they decided to impeach Andrew Johnson because he wasn't enforcing their laws strictly. He wasn't being strict enough, he wasn't being stern enough, and he wasn't enforcing laws. So he gets impeached. After Andrew Johnson is impeached, then another president gets elected, and you may recognize this name. It was Ulysses S. Grant. He was the general of the Union Army, and he gets elected, and he vows to defend the rights of African Americans. So he wants to use the law and the army to stop groups like the KKK from attacking and putting fear and violence into African Americans in the South. So he's going to use the army to do that. He's also going to pass laws to protect the rights of African Americans with the radical Republicans, and he's going to enforce those laws, which is very different than what Andrew Johnson was doing. So if you look at this cartoon and you have this same cartoon on your paper, there's a black guy trying to vote. That is a ballot that he's holding in his hand. He wants to vote with that. And then you've got the white Southerner here who's trying to stop him. He's got a sword, he's got a gun. And then in between the two is the soldier that Ulysses S. Grant has sent to protect the rights of the African Americans, to make sure that they are allowed to vote. So he's protecting it. That was Grant's job, protecting the rights of African Americans using the Army. But then, when Grant has served his 2 terms, so he gets elected once, he gets elected a second time. After the second time that he's elected, he's no longer allowed to run again. So the Republicans put somebody else up to office. His name was Rutherford B. Hayes. And Rutherford B. Hayes' election was conflicted because the Democratic or the Southern politician who wanted to be elected president used violence to stop African Americans from voting. So you had like this guy who was going to vote at the box, and these guys said, "You're not going to vote, or we'll kill you." So of course, most African Americans did not vote because they were under the threat of violence. And so the Democrat who wanted to do away with the rights of African Americans gets way more votes than he should. And the end result was that the Army left the South and no longer could protect the rights of African Americans that were there. That led to the Southern states being able to pass racist Jim Crow laws that separated blacks and whites, entrenched that discrimination in the law. And those laws lasted until Martin Luther King comes along with the civil rights movement 100 years later. So that election of 1870 ended the period of Reconstruction, and African Americans in the United States no longer had the rights that they had for those 10 years after the Civil War.